You will be live soon. Good luck, Meredith. Good afternoon, everyone. So hopefully everyone's here at the Asset Management 101 session. I'm Sue McNeil from University of Delaware, and joining me is Meredith Hill from Maryland DOT, and joining shortly will be Justin Bruner from PennDOT. Justin also sent us a pre-recorded presentation in case something went wrong, so hopefully we'll be okay. We're delighted to do this workshop for the second year in a row. Most of the time we find that we have a wide variety of audience members who have different backgrounds, some just to see what the update is, others to really do an Asset Management 101 workshop or something in between. So I'm going to start off by talking, providing a little background, and then I'm going to turn it over to Meredith and then Justin to give you some particular state DOT experiences, and then I'll come back and talk about some of the resources that are available to you. So I hope everyone gains some things out of it. We have a few polls to keep you engaged as we go along, so don't fall asleep. Look for the polls, and we'll start off. So what you should be seeing is my screen with the workshop information. From today, and we'll start off with some introductions and welcome, and a little bit about the workshop overview and objectives. Then we'll move on to talk a little bit about what is asset management and why we're interested in asset management. And then Meredith will provide her experience from Maryland of developing a TAMP. Justin will present the state DOT perspective. Meredith has made the comment before that that's a nice compliment because Meredith is more of a planner, Justin is more of a techie guy, and then we'll come back and talk about tools and resources and adjourn around 2 o'clock. This is just a summary slide of our background information. Who we are, where we're from, what we actually look like in various versions as opposed to the online version you're seeing today. So one of the things is who you all are, and so as we can't do introductions, which we would, what I wanted to do was just do a poll about what your roles are. So if people could take a few minutes to fill in this poll, I'd greatly appreciate it. So what's your role? Do you describe yourself as an asset management? Are you a pavements person, bridge or other assets, or some other role? So what we have is we have a few responses. We'll give everyone a minute or two. Well, not 2 minutes. 2 minutes will be too long. So the majority of people here don't describe themselves as asset managers or particular pavement, bridge or other assets, but other. So we'll move on to the next one, which is what's your organization? And if people could fill that in. So what we're seeing is that we have the majority, the largest single group of people from state government. but we have a mix of others. So far, no local government or transit agency people, but consultants, contractors, some academics, a few federal government people, and then a few people that describe themselves as other. So again, a diversity of participants in this session. And then the last question I wanted to ask was, how do you describe yourself in terms of your asset management knowledge? Do you describe yourself as a novice, a work in progress, or an expert? I love it. As we flip between them, we get a wide range because of the relatively small sample size. Lots of people who have lots of knowledge. So one of the things is, the more you learn about this field, different perspectives always help to give you an idea of what's going on. And so we have the majority of people describe themselves as work in progress. And I think all of us should really be in that category, because it's a way of evolving and changing. So I just wanted to sort of summarize on the diversity. I hope that we have an opportunity to interact in different ways as we move through this presentation. Now I've got to just work out how to get back to my screen sharing. It's always the fun of learning a new platform.
Hey, Sue, just want to let you know I was here.
Thanks, Justin. Glad you made it. So Justin has joined us, which is great. So what we wanted to cover in this workshop was really defining what we mean by infrastructure and asset management. So you should be able to actually clearly state what it is. Discuss the framework and principles for asset management as they apply to your organization. So that means we won't cover anything in detail. You have to think about what we're talking about, and it'll be up to you to make the leap forward as to how you actually would apply these. So hopefully you'll have some idea of, you'll know where and how to get started with asset management, but it seems that most of you are in that position already, and you'll be able to identify how you can contribute and new ways. And then we're going to discuss the elements of asset management that agencies are already using. So you'll come out of this at the end. I'm armed with some resources and tools to help you and your organization through this process. I just want to start off by talking about some resources to get started. One of the resources that I found particularly interesting is the International Infrastructure Management Manual, which has come out of Australia and New Zealand. They're up to something like their 5th edition of this, but in it they have lots of different case studies and guides, and it's really nicely put together. Unfortunately, it's pretty expensive. But it is aimed very much at making this very functional. Then we have the Asset Management Guide. The original Asset Management Guide came out in 2004. There was an update in 2010, and there's an ongoing update that is occurring. So the original Asset Management Guide set up a framework. It was developed under an NCHRP research process. And then follow on with the supplement, also an NCHRP. And the guides are available through AASHTO and moving forward. And keep your eyes out for the update that was scheduled to be released last year, but had some delays involved in that. All right, so what I wanted to do was actually launch into the introduction to transportation asset management. Before I do that, I want to comment that you should use the chat to ask for technical questions regarding the platform and how to interact, or if you're having problems with the sound or anything like that, you should use the Q&A for the technical questions related to content and the basic asset management 101 concepts, and we'll handle those as we go through them. So in this particular part, I wanted to talk about what we mean by asset management and the principles of good asset management practice, discussing the benefits for an individual agency and why you might do this, and then the 4 key areas of the asset management framework and the good practice in each of the areas. So this is sort of to set the stage that then I'll pass off to Meredith and Justin to give you the particular experiences that they've had oriented towards an organization. So this is the original definition of asset management that came out of the MAP 21 legislation. Asset management is a strategic, systematic process of operating, maintaining, and improving physical assets with a focus on engineering and economic analysis based on quality information to identify a structure, sequence of maintenance, preservation, repair, rehabilitation, and replacement actions that will achieve and sustain a desired state of good repair over the life cycle of the assets at minimum practical cost. And I read that because it's a mouthful. This definition came out of a series of interactions between TRB committees, AASHTO committees, and NCHRP, and has evolved over a period of time, but has had this fundamental core in saying it's strategic and systematic, and it's really covering these areas of operating, maintaining, improving physical assets. There is some variations of what organizations do, but it's rooted in this sort of core principles of understanding the engineering behavior of those assets and really tying it to what it costs and what service deliveries involved in this process. So if you sort of translate this, one of the things I have enjoyed over the years is some interactions with DelDOT, coming from the University of Delaware, and a former director of planning described that as the goody-gook definition, and that really what you're trying to do is the best way to use your limited resources. You really want to make sure you tie this to the performance goals, because performance-based management has become so integral. And the reality is, organizations have been doing asset management for many years. It's how systematic and strategic it is that's been changing. It's going to be a process that's dependent on having good data, that data needs to be sufficient and accurate, and that really you're going to look at the long-term effects of any of the short-term solutions, what you're planning to do at any point in time. But it really is essential, because everyone for the last 2 to 3 decades has been really trying to figure out how to do more with less. The pressure to deliver better and more transportation services with fewer resources. So one of the things that we anchor our view of asset management is in looking at asset lifecycle activities. The idea that you can start off with asset planning, which comes out of some requirements definition, can go into asset creation, operations and maintenance, asset monitoring, renewal and rehabilitation, and disposal. And you're doing this in this larger context of the financial management, of making sure you're going to be able to sustain that over its life, looking at the lowest long-term costs, community outputs, and managing the risk exposure. So part of this is changing the mindset. The short-term thinking, which is the natural tendency, moving away from the political preferences, the the lowest first initial costs to this discipline of the long-term thinking of both internal and external costs and impacts, considerations of the next generation, and a strong leadership to move the process forward. So it's a different way of thinking about this idea of how you deliver transportation assets. So the fundamental principles are here. These 5 principles are critical. Excuse me. So policy driven, the idea that you're setting the goals and objectives for your system performance and condition and service levels, and making decisions that are related to those policies. That it's performance-based in that you're using the clear measures of performance and target service levels that are established to actually implement those decisions. That there are multiple options that are evaluated, so there are comprehensive choices and trade-offs at every level in the decision making that look at trade-offs between projects and trade-offs in time, and so the between projects can be in space and in the nature of the particular projects. The idea of trading off between investments in maintenance versus a rehabilitation versus a reconstruction. The 4th principle is that the decisions are based on quality information, and this will come back multiple times, but the idea is that you're using management systems and tools that are anchored in this information. And then lastly, that it has clear accountability, that the performance results are monitored and reported as you move through these things. So at its core, asset management is really about resource allocation and utilization. What buckets of money go where? When are you doing it? So I like to think of it as this idea of a time-space allocation problem. And then once you've done the allocation, how are you utilizing it? And it can be a back and forth between these things. And the sophistication of the tools that you're going to use to do this will vary on how good that data is supporting it and the level of maturity in your organization as you're implementing this. So the next few slides are a series of some of the flowcharts that have been used over the years to describe this. And the idea is that they all say very similar things. They just have different emphasis. So this is one of the charts that came out of the original asset management guide that you're starting off with policy goals and objectives, and you look using those to analyze options and trade-offs related to preservation, operations, and capacity. And then that information feeds into the resource allocation decisions. So that's things related to the financial side of it, the staff, the equipment, and others. And then that feeds into program delivery. And then there's the longer term systems monitoring and performance results. So off to the right-hand side are funding levels and customer input. And obviously there's a feedback loop in all of these as those things are influenced by the various decisions that get made. So the funding levels can be thought of as external in a simple version, and then a more complicated version could say that I'm going to use my understanding of these inputs of the process to influence funding levels to the extent possible. This slide I won't go through in the same level of detail, but this is an idea of putting this idea of asset management in a total business context. The idea is that a strategic planning process could feed into a surface level review process that feeds into the asset management process that then produces the solutions and the implications of those particular solutions, and then the implementation. So the idea is that we describe asset management as a strategic process, but it's really the tactical planning of the implementation of the larger strategic process. Again, in this figure, you see on the left-hand side customer expectations, which become important, and then legislative requirements, so financial and environmental, in the process. This diagram comes out of the International Infrastructure Management Manual, and it's their process diagram of the elements that are included in their process as they go through. You'll see it's got the same kind of thing, but we're getting now into a little bit more detail in that what we're doing is we're taking, collecting data, or we're adding that to base knowledge, we're defining levels of service. Excuse me. We're predicting the growth and demand, and we're assessing condition, and then we're looking at what the implications of that. So they're looking at failures and risk and coming up with some kind of optimal solution, seeing how that contributes to the finance and preparing the asset management plan. The IIM actually has supporting manuals that go with it. So there's a contract management manual, there's asset value and depreciation, optimization, decision making, and so they've pulled together a sort of collection of supporting documents that become useful. So the asset management framework that comes out of all this is really addressing these set of questions. What is the state of my assets? What's my required level of service? What assets are critical to sustain performance? So this is putting some priorities on things. What are my best operations and maintenance, capital improvement, investment strategies? And what's my best long-term funding strategy? So that those questions get answered in this process. So if we come back and look at each of the questions in a little bit more detail, what is the state of my assets? That raises a whole bunch of other questions. Inventory, this is the idea of an asset register, depending on what terminology you prefer to use. Most of the US organizations use the idea of an asset inventory. So what do you own? Where is it? What condition it's in? What is its remaining useful life? And what's its remaining economic value? Now, of course, there are other things that we can add into this that relate to the performance of the asset and its connection to other assets. So the level of sophistication in this, what is the state of my assets, can vary fairly significantly depending on how you're going to use it. But this is the fundamental information that we have to begin with if we're really looking at this asset management framework. From there, this idea of creating what's the appropriate level of service. So this is where we start to recognize that we don't provide transportation assets simply because we think it's a fun thing to do. We remember that we're providing service to stakeholders, customers, whatever you want to, language you want to use, and that that level of demand and their expectations on the level of service and what's reasonable to deliver has to come together and make those decisions. There are also some regulatory requirements. So there are some things we take for granted. So we know that if we're delivering transportation assets that have federal funds, there are certain requirements we have to make, that we have some expectations on environmental approvals and safety that are important. And then we need to look at what's the actual performance that's delivered. And some of these pictures I included in here to make some points. So there's simple things about the picture in the top right, which is the grate that's not really working. putting some cones on it is not a solution over the long term, but it's examples of the little things that are not appropriate levels of service because it's not safe, it's not working in the right way. The one in the bottom right is a low volume bridge in upstate New York, recognizing that, and it's a relatively new bridge. It was replaced a year and a half ago. And it's recognizing that you have different needs in different contexts. Excuse me. So the next one is which of the assets are critical to sustain performance, and this is where we start to look at implications of failure and importance of the asset and what it means. There's been a lot more emphasis on failure in the last 10 to 15 years than there were in the preceding 10 to 15 years. And integrating that with repair and long-term decisions. But we start to explicitly ask what are the failure modes? What can they be and what actually are they likely to be? What's the likelihood? What does it cost to repair it? What are the consequences of that failure? So disruption, and then how to mitigate the failures. So these become important as you start to look at the different elements. Then this question of what are my best operations and maintenance, capital improvement, investment strategies. So it's asking the questions of what are the alternative management options and what's the most feasible for an organization. So again, I wanted to illustrate scale. On the bottom left is the new Tappan Zee Bridge, which has a different name across the Hudson, under construction. A major investment. On the bottom right is a parking lot at University of Delaware, and important to maintain it, manage those assets, but a very different scale in how you do that. So what's feasible for the organization, what are the options? You're looking at things at different scales depending on what type of organization you have. So most of our people on this call state DOTs. That was the majority of the people that responded. And looking at a large scale of minor to major assets depending on what your particular organization manages. In Delaware DOT manages everything from large scale assets down to local streets. So you've got a large scale, large variation in scale. So then the next sort of question in the framework is what is the best long-term funding strategy? And so you have to tie this to what the revenues are that you have, what is the gap or surplus to meet those, and how does that tie in to any risk tolerance levels? And so what you're trying to do is come up with the optimum mix of the different types of activities and what's your alternative if you can't afford that. So there's different ranges in thinking about the assets that you need for the longer term. So alternative fueling stations as shown in the picture in the top right, versus the bottom, which is a set of assets owned by the state parks in Delaware. And you look at this and you say, well, unpaved road, not very important, not there. But this unpaved road is connected with some simple wooden bridges that wash out fairly frequently. And one of the questions is, what should you be doing to maintain these set of assets and what are there? And it turns out that one of the service objectives of the state parks is to provide an educational experience for school children. And so they actually have to bring school buses over those bridges, those wooden bridges that wash out. So if they don't do that, then they have to change their programming and they have to change some perspectives. So the service delivery and what makes sense over the long-term strategy has to be routed back, anchored back to those service goals, and inventory that we talked about earlier. All right, so I'm going to stop here and take any questions, but I also just wanted to launch another poll. So I started off by sort of saying that we had these set of questions that an organization would ask, what is the state of my asset? What my required levels of service? And so I'm interested in knowing which of these things apply to organize you work with, or what you're interested in. So if people could take a minute to just do that. We're still changing a little bit. So the majority of people have said that what particularly applies is this idea of what are the best operations and maintenance and capital improvement investment strategies. So all of those things should apply, because you can't really do any of them without the others, and so that becomes important. So what I would encourage people to do is to add any questions to the chat session. It's very different to being in the online version versus being in a room where we actually would get to be able to ask have interaction. But please type stuff into the Q&A and use the chat if you have technical issues in putting those together. So, all right. I'm going to pass over to Meredith now. And I think, Meredith, you should be able to share your screen.
Okay. Audio check while I share my screen. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Fabulous. Okay. It appears my system is slow to respond, so excuse me while it's thinking about cooperating. Sue, can you stop sharing? I'm wondering if it's not letting me because you haven't stopped. Oh, my mic's on. I didn't have to give you the thumbs up. Okay, hold on just a second. Okay.
Meredith, this is Corinna. It seems like some people are saying you're a bit on the quiet side and that it's hard to hear. So I don't know if you can be closer to your mic, but that might help.
Okay, I will try that. Are you seeing my PowerPoint? Or are you seeing my full screen while I do this?
Now I see your full screen.
Okay, excellent.
The presentation mode.
You're in presentation mode. Okay, perfect.
Yes.
Okay. Is my audio a little bit better?
It is when you put your head down, so that must mean your mouth is to the mic.
Okay, we'll try that. So let's see. Okay. You'll be responsible for answering if I go quiet again, but I'll just keep going until I hear you. So the purposes of my conversation today with you is to build off of a lot of what Sue talked about in terms of the tactical planning realm. Embedded through my presentation are these little hands and question marks because they will recognize when I'm going to pivot to the next topic. So if you need to enter your question before you forget it, that would be the time to do it, but I'll answer all questions at the end of my presentation since I can't see the box while I talk.
Meredith, I'm going to just jump in real quick again. If you could try maybe to lift the mic and hold it a bit closer to your mouth, that might work. Now we can't hear you at all. So I think it worked if you held the mic just a bit closer, so it would pick up more of your audio.
Is it better here?
Oh yes, that's nice.
Okay, thank you for that. But I got to go back to the presentation now.
Thank you so much.
Of course, no, I needed that. Okay. So as Sue talked about, there are federal requirements for infrastructure condition and performance management and asset management, and they tie to national goals. It's important whenever I talk through this stuff with any number of audiences, especially when I'm teaching within MDOT, to always tie it back to the Maryland transportation goals. And you'll see those on the screen, and there's 3 that tie directly to asset management. That's promote the fiscal responsibility. It's the ensure safe, secure, and resilient transportation systems. And then also the maintain high standard and modernize Maryland's multimodal transportation system.
And Meredith, I don't believe you're sharing your screen anymore.
Yeah, I was just going to add the same.
I will. Okay, how'd that stop? Let's try this again. Am I sharing now?
Yes.
So much for the help session last week. I apparently didn't take notes.
Perfect.
Okay, so it's always important for what I do in a planning realm to tie the relationship to our planning exercises back to the delivery of the products and services of MDOT. So I always start with the Maryland transportation goals, and they complement the national goals, but then also give us the vision and the mission that we deliver on every day at Maryland. So planning, whether it is the entirety of what MDOT does and MDOT State Highway Administration or asset management specifically, is the iterative process of planning, investing, evaluating, and then adjusting. And working from that, we start with the Maryland Transportation Plan, which includes those goals that I just showed you, our 6-year capital improvement program, which is the Consolidated Transportation Program. And then performance is reported annually and evaluated quarterly. And that's really, really important that we are doing this iterative process regularly, routinely, so that we are always looking at the performance management element. Then when you get down to asset management, which is also an iterative process, at MDOT, it's framed by asset management policy applicable to all business units. Those are the modes that are under MDOT's umbrella. And then informed by the strategic asset management plan for MDOT, which is the high-level vision for asset management. And then driven by the TBUs, which State Highway is one of, asset management plans. So again, it's a multi-tiered process. It drives down to plans and then implementation. But it's all, when you get to asset management, we are focused on the business-focused asset management plan. My work is to develop a plan that is really supporting a unified asset management program for our agency. It's focused on the action plan to mature asset management practices. So we have everything from the novice to the very mature expert programs, and we're trying to learn from each other and mature everybody into not uniformity, but into consistent practices to inform decisions in a cross-asset environment in SHA. We're documenting the plans, basically how the sausage is made for each individual asset class. What does state of good repair mean for that asset? What does life cycle management mean for that asset? What is their criticality framework for that asset? Because until each individual asset class knows what they own, knows its condition, has the protocols in place to routinely inspect and understand, and mature to the place where they are doing modeling and optimized programming, it's very difficult to then bring them into an agency cross-asset environment for decision making. So we're really focused on the behind the scenes, how the sausage is made documentation, so that we can identify those strategies and opportunities to improve practice and bring them into the system management. We are always hyper-focused on the financial need. There's always going to be more need than there are resources. So we need to really drive down to understand what that need is and inform it by criticality. So we're prioritizing where and when to invest in system preservation. All of this is right now focused on a handful of our roughly 14 asset classes and about 75 asset types, because we did a cross section of critical assets from which we can build a framework and template to bring in additional assets as we can, as resources are available to me and my team, and as maturity evolves through each of the asset classes. So I'm going to pause here for a second and recognize what's on the right hand of the screen, and that's the Transportation Asset Management Plan for the National Highway System. So Sue talked about what's federally required. What was federally required was an asset management plan for the bridge and pavement of the National Highway System. We delivered that in Maryland. M.SHA did so on behalf of about 13 partner owners of NHS assets. So that's the National Park Service that owns the, I never remember what it's called, Maryland 295, Baltimore, Washington Parkway. They own that section. So we had to coordinate with federal partners. Local partners included counties, municipalities, and then other TBUs within MDOT. The Aviation Administration owns their entry route into BWI. And of course, our toll authority owns a large portion of I-95 going through Maryland. So we had to organize a whole bunch of partner owners to develop the TAIM. It absolutely was a great plan in terms of identifying opportunities for shared goals of the NHS and developing a coordination and collaboration with partner owners. But at the end of the day, the NHS assets are not how we at M.SHA manage our portfolio, and it's not really how any of our partner owners do so either. They do so in terms of functionality or their whole portfolio. So it's a really good coordination and collaboration document, but it is sort of a static plan that we will revisit as federally required. So what I'm talking about today is asset management, business-focused asset management planning for SHA specifically, and our roughly 14 asset classes and 75 asset types. We at SHA, we are routinely moving between asset performance risk management. These are all complementary, they're all stacked, and they're all part of the management strategy. So, you know, when we're looking at risk, it's an important consideration to understand where we need to invest to mitigate for known and unknown risks. We need to have these maintenance strategies in place from the start, from the conception of an asset through its retirement and removal, so that we are always managing the life cycle cost at the which we hope to be the minimal if the life cycle management strategy is in place. It's fiscally constrained. We all are fiscally constrained, but in a planning environment, the challenge that I have had with my team is to unconstrain them, to encourage them to work in the fiscally unconstrained but expertly informed environment. We cannot ever get the money that we need for all of our asset needs, but we absolutely aren't ever going to get it if we don't know what that dollar amount need is. And so I routinely have to challenge them to come out of fiscally constraining themselves. Leave that to somebody else to constrain you. I need to know what your actual need is. And then we can work to figure out how to inform that and refine that need. So the ways that we inform and refine that is looking at performance, looking at the targets and the levels of service that you have assigned for your assets, see if those are the right place for them, and then also to understand your risks and see if there are lower level assets that are lower risk, and so we mitigate that way. But it's iterative. It's continually evaluating and repeating the cycle throughout. So I want to talk a moment about what the planning up until this point has brought to fruition. So for about a year now, probably this time last year when I presented this, I was probably saying we were on the verge of getting an asset management office at SHA. A year later, we're on the verge of getting an asset management office at SHA. Still hasn't launched, but little things have happened. We now have a deputy administrator of operations for Hanover, which is essentially centralized operations as opposed to our district management. And this individual oversees things like our mature pavement program, our Office of Construction, our Office of Maintenance, and will oversee the asset management office. The asset management office is being charged with 3 primary realms of responsibility. Asset data operations, so we have to know what we own, we have to know its condition, and we have to understand how to use that information regularly, and hopefully through the launch of the asset management office at an enterprise level. So the asset information is being uploaded to a mothership of multiple asset information. Asset optimization is the evolution to not only looking at today's information and historic information, but really using it to project and to model scenarios, optimization in the future so that we can make those budget allocations. And then the third arm is asset project delivery. Innovative contracting methods, whether it's P3 or just design build, and then performance-based fund management. And that's the biggest differential for SHA, is to look at, we have finite dollars, so we need to know that you are looking at performance outcomes and mitigating for risk as we're funding projects. This was formalized in SHA's 5-year strategic plan that was just launched this summer as a initiative to formalize operational infrastructure asset management. I still cannot say that quickly, but the reason that there are so many words in there is because, again, we chose the model, a little bit of a hybrid model of industry best practices to embed asset management under operations but also we're focused on the infrastructure that we are managing and not necessarily the pens and the chairs and those types of internal assets that we still as a public agency have to be accountable for. So we've really formalized a program that is on the verge of launching. Please don't let me say that again next year. It is all subject to getting a new director for the asset management office and reorganizing existing resources, existing people to staff the office, and then we'll be off and running, I hope. So again, if you have questions over what I've discussed so far, I'm going to pivot, so write them down now before you forget, and then I'll come back to them at the end. So when we started the asset management plan for all of the identified critical assets, and you'll see them on the left-hand side of your screen, we pretty quickly identified some challenges in this data operations, the data collection and interpretation side of the house. That we're balancing priorities. Some asset classes are mature because they are federally required or state required to collect this information and to report it. So they're a little bit further along. Those discretionary assets that maybe the department has put into place expectations for them, and maybe they haven't. So all of our asset classes were at very different maturity levels. That was a challenge, to meet them where they are and to then slowly move all of them along. We do not yet have enterprise asset management systems for cross assets. We have a few assets covered in a couple of systems, but we do not have the mothership. Thus far, we haven't needed it, but it would be helpful, and we're always looking at that, but we're hopeful. So back to meeting the asset classes where they are. They're decentralized in so much as their asset lifecycle authority rests with the subject matter expertise office. And those individuals in the new framework will stay there. What is being centralized into the asset management office is the fund management, the performance management across assets. But recognizing their authority, decentralized authority, was a challenge for the agency planning effort. There's different investments currently in inspection programs to really know your assets, know the types and the ancillary asset types, and know on a cyclical basis what their state is. So we needed as an agency to invest in funding inspections so that we could know what we own and its condition on a cyclical basis. All of this is informed by industry best practices and protocols, learning from each other, the mature assets and the complex assets, teaching the maturing assets. And some of what I've discussed thus far, if you are familiar or would like more information about the industry best practice, I would encourage you to Google TAIM guide.com. That's a good learning resource if you are maturing in your understanding, but I'll come back and give you that website later. Money. It's all about the money. We don't have it. There is a 10-year forecasted state of good repair need of $9.9 billion. So nearly $1 billion a year to maintain the critical assets listed in the middle of the screen. And we have a 10-year gap of needing $4.3 billion. This was as of February of this year. The number has gone up since then. But this was an important visualization. This was a grab and go resource that our leadership was able to take to the state legislature during budget season and really talk through what backs up this need. And again, we don't expect them to come up with $4.3 billion to fill the gap, but it's demonstrating that we know what that real need is to achieve and maintain the state of good repair for each of these asset classes that we as an agency have defined, we need more money. Also, the other really powerful visualization that we have for each individual asset class is what's on the right side of your screen, what we call the waterfall chart. So at the beginning of this year, there were 31 units, doesn't matter what this was for, units that were below what we defined for them to be in a state of good repair. That's our backlog. Given the amount of money that this particular asset class had available to them in a fiscal year, they would be able to knock down 8 of those out of backlog and into a state of good repair. But in that year, another 14 were going to fall below their useful life or be triggered into their backlog. And so what it's visualizing is, without sufficient money, our backlog's going to continue to grow. This was incredibly impactful visual for those assets that are a little bit harder to communicate criticality to legislature. A good example to that would be drainage and assets that can't visually be seen by the driving public or understood necessarily. It's really hard to communicate that that is still an important section of our entire asset portfolio. If we fall out of state of good repair significantly enough, our entire construction program can shut down due to permitting and things like that. So this is all strengthening the conversation with the decision makers, with the policy holders, with the approvers of our capital budget. And these are all products that are coming out of the cross-asset planning initiative through my team. So I've already touched on this a little bit, but obviously we are always looking to manage risk and understand criticality. And we're doing that right now at the asset level, because you have to start there. They have to understand their risks and criticality as assigned by that team for that asset. Once all of that is complete, we can bring it into an agency decision about trade-offs. Not easy conversations to have, but Sue's example of the Tappan Zee Bridge versus parking lots is a really good example. If you only are looking at those two, then parking lots are never going to get invested in. Obviously, the Tappan Zee Bridge is more critical than a parking lot. But if you have informed information about risk and criticality and service provide of that parking lot, you can make the argument that it needs to be invested in, not at the expense of the critical bridge, but it still needs to be invested in. And it's all about those performance and the level of service that we need and have committed to providing to our public. So we are working across, individual asset classes with each of them to assign a criticality framework and the documentation thereof. And all of this information is getting boiled down to a 1 to 5 or 3-point scale, depending on their maturity level and complexity. But the point of 1 to 5 is not to lessen the importance of understanding criticality, but to be able to, again, inform that sort of enterprise system in a uniform language across all asset classes. So 1 to 5 is, or 1 to 3 if they're not, if they don't need 5, is where we're pushing each team. So in summary, I want to always go back to where I started: the goals, the asset management strategies, the outcomes. This is the framework for success. This is what we communicate individually, cross-asset, to our agency leadership to demonstrate that we understand what the goals are and we have measurable outcomes for everything in between. So back to the asset management office. Now, we are absolutely focused on data management, getting all of the right attributes for all assets, but housed with the individual teams, so that if we do have an enterprise asset management system, there's a universal language of data to inform it. We are setting it up in the operations realm to intimately connect operations, maintenance, and full life cycle management of each asset class. We are regularly understanding and communicating the need for inspection programs to be funded, and backing that up with giving them the tools to, as easily as possible, as automated as possible, do those inspections, and informing all of that into the financial forecast. Again, the financial forecast in the planning environment is fiscally unconstrained but expertly informed. It is extremely challenging to get my asset class sponsors to unconstrain themselves, because we always are looking at just trying to make those tough decisions based on available resources. But the long-term plan is to understand that there's a strategy in place that can respond to the short-term volatility. And we learned that unbelievably in year 2 with unprecedented revenue halts that we are in right now. And if we didn't have this process in place to be able to respond to the short-term volatilities, we would be that much more behind in these critical, difficult funding decisions. So, like I said, it is an iterative process. It's in a planning environment, and pieces are being implemented in operations every day, and we're maturing our classes every day. We're moving along the path, and we are hoping to be the foundation for success when the asset management office launches and our new deputy administrator of operations, actually we have 2 of those, hit their stride and really exponentially move SHA practice forward for decades to come, I hope. So with that, I want to close by making a shameless pitch for the next opportunity to come together. Our Secretary of Transportation for Maryland, Greg Slater, is chair of the TRB 13th National Conference for Transportation Asset Management. It was supposed to happen in July of this year, but has been rescheduled to August of next year. Calls for abstracts are currently open through the end of this month. And I want to stress that even if you're not sure you can travel in August of 2021, none of us are, and even if you're not sure it's actually going to happen in person, please, please, please submit your abstracts if you're interested in presenting at that conference, because while those decisions about virtual haven't been made yet, it'll be easier for us to populate a program if you submit your abstracts. Share that with your networks, please. Again, the call for abstracts is open until the end of the month. And virtual or in person, I certainly hope that you're interested in continuing your education for asset management at that conference and other events along the way. So I will turn it back to you, Sue.
Thanks, Meredith. Please, if you have questions, add them to the Q&A. I want to reiterate that what you saw in Meredith's presentation was some different terminology for some of the same principles that I talked about, and what you're starting to see is a bit of meat on the bones now of how one particular organization was able to pull together their process and how it's evolving over time, because this is never a static thing. You don't do an asset management plan, you don't do an asset management process, you always continue to evolve and change. And I think that came across pretty clearly in what Meredith was talking about. But it's the same kind of elements, the idea of a process the idea of having data that goes into that process, and thinking about what you're trying to deliver and how it goes to those larger planning goals. Anything you want to add to that, Meredith?
No,
No.
I did exactly that. As you were speaking, I was adding your language to my slides to try to be
Right.
consistent, but you're absolutely right. Everybody uses a little bit of their own language to get to the same thing.
So anyway, please, add questions as we go through, as we evolve through this process. I know it's a little hard in the virtual environment to actually do that. But what I'm going to do now is hand over to Justin. And Justin, you should be able to share your screen.
Okay, let's see if this works.
We all live in hope.
All right, so as I figure this part out, yeah, let's do this. All right, can you see my screen?
We are. It's great.
So
Okay.
see the background, right? All right, let's hope this works. Okay, so let me kick this thing off. It's been general practice to pre-record all of these things. I'm not sure which version this is. If this is the pre-recorded, I'm going to let it play. But the idea here is I want to talk about just general asset management 101, how to make it, the general core tenets behind all of that. And then typically that lends for a nice forum for discussion, because there's so many points to all of this. So let me kick this off here and see if I'm going to be doing it live or if it's going to do it virtually. Hello, I'm Justin Greer, and that's Bridge Asset Management Section Chief and Asset Management Engineer. And today we're going to talk about Asset Management 101. So before we get into too much Asset Management 101, let's first talk about PennDOT, who we are and what we do. We have a lot of stuff. We have 40,000 miles of roadway, 25,000 bridges, 3 ports, 128 airports. There's 11.8 million registered vehicles and 102 billion annual vehicle miles traveled. That's a lot. We also have 11,375 employees, 53 transit systems. You get the idea. There's a lot of stuff going on here. So we have to know asset management. We are 6th in the population of the U.S. And fun fact, Carlisle, PA, not too far from here, is a 10-hour drive to 50% of the population of the United States. So locally, we see a lot of warehouses popping up because of that fact. There's 86,000 miles of streams, 6 rivers, so we have a lot of crossings to make. We have the oldest and largest inventory in the Northeast. We got that inventory by building, and building a lot. We've been building since the early 1900s. In fact, 1694 or 7, I believe, is the Pennypack Bridge, is the oldest continually used highway bridge in the country. And as you can see, we built a lot prior to 1900, and then, of course, in the 1960s, we had a very big build out. And again, in the 2010s, but we do have a lot of inventory. The same with roads. We have a massive building program in the 1930s and again in the 50s and 60s. So we have a lot of inventory. There's many, many miles, segment miles of roadway that PennDOT owns. And asset management isn't new to PennDOT. PennDOT was an early adopter. In fact,
Justin, can you increase your volume?
2003, talking about the implementation of asset management in the department at that time. We'll try that.
And then when you're presenting, you might have to swap your view.
Oh, right. I'm sorry. But you know what? We'll just we'll continue on without the audio if I can. Let me will takes. Sorry. Will shit. Oh, sorry. There we go. Okay. Well, this should resolve the audio issues, hopefully. I just needed to switch my displays. Oh man.
Yeah, right at the top of your PowerPoint, you could swap the display right over there.
In the display settings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry about
Oh.
that.
That's perfect now.
Okay. Well, let's get back here. I think this is where I was. Probably.
Yep.
Likely.
All right. That's good.
So asset management isn't new. We were an early adopter. FHWA had the good sense to interview us back in 2003 regarding our asset management practices. We were actually pretty advanced at the time. We had a lot of things in the works. Then we furthered that on. The asset management division was formed in 2011. And the first TAMP draft was done in 2012. So let's get to painless asset management in 3 easy steps, right? So step 1, we need to create our core tenants. Step 2 is work towards lowest lifecycle cost. And step 3 is generate a system. So step 1 is our core tenants, right? We've talked about this before. You've heard others talk about this. You need inventory, condition, deterioration, treatments, and costs. These are all relatively basic things we need to get, and they're not too hard to get. So in terms of inventory, we need a record of our assets, right? So this is your asset registry, as the international term is, but really you just need a list of what you have. And the more detail you have, the better. You can do this in Excel, Access, SQL, whatever you want, however you want, but as long as you have a list of the things that you own, that's good. So in PennDOT, we are very fortunate. We have BMS2 and RMS. They are incredibly detailed databases that have all the data, house all of our data. They have the systems of record. But for some of our smaller assets, they're held in spreadsheets, and that's okay. It works. You don't have to put too much effort into it, as long as it's appropriate for the size of your asset inventory. So condition. So you need to know when to replace it. So you need to know what you're measuring. So the length, the volume, the rating, the age, any of those things, right? You need to know what you're measuring. And it has to be consistent and repeatable, and a QC process to make that happen. So we have a very advanced schema. It's greater than the requirements that FHWA provides. We collect a lot more data on both our pavement and bridge than is required, and we use that in our asset management systems to forecast need. Now, deterioration, one of my favorite subjects. How something degrades through time. So there are many ways of doing this. You can just do it linearly. So you know that brand new, it's in condition 10. When it's done, it's in condition 0. And you can just divide it out by the number of years. That's your linear. You can do the Markov or deterministic modeling. Here at PennDOT, we have a bunch of different asset types. So we do different types of deterioration per asset. So for bridges and pavements, they actually differ. But we do some version of deterministic and Markov models for both. Okay, for treatments, this is the fun engineering side. So what repairs are performed on an asset? And we like to keep this on a contract level. That makes it easiest, right? So when you think about letting a contract to repair something, whether it be a bridge or a road, that's the kind of type of accuracy you need for your estimate. So for us, it varies. We have about 23 different treatments for pavements and 13 different treatments for bridges. But again, that's, contract level. These are the things that say, hey, we're going to do, say, a joint replacement, right? So that's the kind of level we're talking about here. So it doesn't need to get down to the tons of asphalt or the number of bolts on a railing. That's a little too detailed. And finally, costs. Your total loaded unit cost per treatment is incredibly important. And these can vary enormously throughout your geographic range, so they have to be flexible. But you want to make sure that these costs are accurate, because you want to make sure that you're capturing MOB and maintenance protection of traffic, and whether or not you're including your overhead or your design costs, right? So depending on how you're structured financially, depends on how your costs will be entered into your system. For PennDOT, we're very fortunate we have ECMS. We have ECMS cost data. So it lets us know about what each treatment costs us, because we can go back and query that data, because we've had that system for about 10 years. And then finally, risk, right? Risk sort of sits over all of this. So we didn't actually count it one of the core tenets, but it influences everything that we do, right? And this on the right is your standard FHWA risk chart. But the reality is risk requires context. You want to make sure you're using the right level of risk in what you're looking at. So your enterprise, your agency risk is that super high level risk. You know, do I repair this massive river crossing versus, say, another highway reconstruction? But it can get down lower into the weeds, down through your program, your project, and your task. So some mitigation strategies or processes are in place to reduce risk. So therefore, they're not counted in your typical planning process. But in general, risk is a core tenet of prioritization. So for us, the prioritization is risk and condition. So once you have your core tenets nailed down, which isn't all that difficult, then you need to understand lowest life cycle cost. And this is not a difficult concept. We even have an infographic that we circulate, just showing the benefits. Essentially, it's maintenance. I say it's always maintenance first, but really it's maintaining the things that you have on a risk basis. So the higher risk things that you have, they should be maintained earlier than the lower risk things that you have. At its core, it's the lowest practical, or the lowest lifecycle cost on the network teams. Sorry, lowest lifecycle cost on the network level. But it's good practice for owners, and it's the lowest cost of ownership over the life of the asset. So it's not a difficult concept, but sometimes it takes people a bit to understand, because most people are really ingrained in the older worst first methodology. So let's just use a bridge deck as an example. And let's just say it starts out in condition 9 and degrades through its time frame down to almost condition level 3. All right. So if you did nothing, this is what it would look like for its condition rating. Now let's say that early on in its life, you applied an epoxy overlay. Okay. It's super cheap, 25 bucks a square foot. So that then increases its condition rating over time. Now, in theory, it should then just follow that same degradation line. But we have other options available to us. We can do this latex later on at, say, 20 years and get it back to the same level of condition. And then look how much longer it lasts for us. Now, after that, we could, in theory, do a rehabilitation at not fairly insignificant cost, right? Because new construction is about 650 bucks a square foot. But that's really why do the rehabilitation then when you have the option of doing something else? The time B here looks at your total cost for just the latex and the rehab, when in reality, we could be doing those latexes multiple times and extending the life of the bridge much, much further for a very low cost per square foot. And on top of that, you're spreading that cost out over a number of years, which makes it much more tolerable. So the concept here is just maintaining, when you can, at the appropriate time, your infrastructure. Okay, let's get past that. So those actions can be calculated based on those core tenets. And those calculated actions are often referred to as rules. So we spend a lot of time working on our rules. So just as a basic example, so for bridges that are less than 20 feet and are greater than 75 years old, would not be eligible for an epoxy treatment. So that's just a super basic rule that we have. We actually have an enormous amount of rules that we've come up with for both bridges and pavements. There are pages and pages of these. But those rules are employed in a system using modal logic to generate those lowest life cycle cost outputs. Because as you remember, there's cost and time associated with it. So it's kind of hard to do that off the cuff. So really what we're driving at here is from those core tenets, with a multi-objective decision analysis engine, you can do lowest life cycle cost planning, right? So you can have the lowest cost of the network. So let's jump in. Geez, sorry, it's auto advancing. So let's jump into the system. A MODA is a multi-objective decision analysis. It compares cost benefit of all eligible treatments at one time, right? Within a constrained budget that can import existing work that utilizes all core tenets and incorporates risk, right? Those outputs are constrained to the dollars you put into it. That's really important because we're typically used to looking at the dollars we have available. It's relatively easy if you have a MOTA to do your unconstrained budgets, but they're so huge, it's hard to actually get your head around. So for PennDOT, the bridge side of things, we use Bridge Care, right? It's a system that we developed that allows us to look at all those different options. So really what Bridge Care allows us to do is look at funding options to say, hey, what funding levels should we be investing in bridges at, right? So here's a graph that shows a bunch of different levels of funding, starting at 377 million and working up to 1.57 billion. As you can see, the more money you put to it, the longer we stay compliant in this, for reference only example, the longer we stay compliant through the years of staying less than 10% on the NHS. That's really important because that lets us say, okay, no matter what we're spending currently, what should we be spending so that we know we're either over or under investing. So if we were spending, well, let's say the green line at 977 million, that would put us out of compliance in about the planning period, which would not be where we need to be. Therefore, we would be underspending. If we were spending the brown line, which in this example is 1.3 billion, that would be the definition of overinvesting. You're spending a lot of money on your system, but you're not getting much change in your overall conditions. So from a investment standpoint, based on our performance periods here, you look at that dark blue line at about 1.2 billion, that seems to be the ideal investment strategy in this reference only example. So because these are fairly complex calculations, you need a MOTA to run this, right? So we have 25,400 structures. We run each structure out over 100 years for all the eligible treatments. There's a lot of things that go on here. But you will notice across the top that we have the exact same things that we saw before with our core tenants. The investment, the performance, this is technically your deterioration, but your treatments, the priorities we use, and the cash. So those are all inputs we use into the system to get us outputs that look a lot like this to the planners. And these are really helpful because really the outputs of our systems are individualized treatments, individualized recommended treatments per structure for every planning period. So for this particular year, we have a series of bridges as an example here, which project it was picked, which budget it came out of, and the actual recommended treatment that it wants for that particular bridge. So as a sort of recap, as again, it's super easy to do, particularly step one, is to have those 5 core tenants. And then step 2 is to understand your lowest life cycle cost logic. And then finally, step 3 is to have a system in place that does the multi-objective decision analysis that analyzes all of your information and gives you outputs that are based in lowest life cycle cost. So with that, I will stop sharing that and move to, this typically leads to a bunch of questions that we can then work through in the chat box here. Okay. You guys still hear me? Great.
Yep. All right. So questions. Please feel free to add experiences that relate to this or comments about how things come together. What you've heard from Meredith and Justin is examples of how particular states have implemented their asset management, their process that's involved. What you see from both of these states is a wide diversity of assets. Meredith talked about the different stakeholders. Justin talked about just how many assets PennDOT has and the challenges of a long history of having to manage assets. So hopefully some folks have some questions. We've got a whole bunch of people on who've got a wide range of experiences in doing these kinds of things. And so feel free to add in the chat box the Q&A box comments that might relate to a particular experience or how it comes together. So I'm going to take the prerogative of actually being able to not type my question, but ask the question. So you talked about your 54 pages of rules, Justin.
Sure.
And so are those rules intended largely to constrain, to limit the problem, recognizing that, you know, there's just some logical things that you wouldn't do. So the example you gave of a small bridge that was old that you wouldn't do a particular time of treatment makes some sense. But can you perhaps give a couple more of those rules and talk a little bit about the process of how they were developed?
Sure. So we worked with our district bridge engineers over probably about an 18-month period to figure out what treatments were available and when you would do those treatments and to which particular subsection of structures to operate the lowest life cycle cost. So that is actually a very complex problem. We could probably spend a couple of days talking about this, because when you look at your treatments in general and try to put them in categories and just essentially assign a framework to them. First, we had to develop a concept of what would make a bridge last the longest. You know, this sort of ideal treatment schedule, right? So we had to define that, and then that's different for every bridge family. So there's a bunch of different bridge families, a bunch of different culvert families. So first we sort of defined those, and then so that's your first takeaway at this. So you have this sort of ideal concept of when a treatment should be applied. So that was the easy part. The hard part is saying, okay, unfortunately, we didn't maintain all of our structures to that ideal time, right? That ideal schedule of maintenance. So now we have a bunch of stuff out there that's eligible for treatment, but we want to make sure that we're applying the right treatment to it. So we sat down and made this huge matrix that analyzes all of the structures and applies a risk-based framework to them to say, all right, under what conditions would bridge A be eligible for something, right? And then the program goes through and looks at all of those, all the eligible treatments per structure, spits them out into a table, and then ranks them on cost benefit, and then uses a risk routine to pull out recommended treatments based on that.
So a fairly elaborate process.
Yes.
Thank you. So Meredith, there's a question for you in the chat. Can you describe Maryland systems for each of the assets?
My system is very slow to respond to unmute. So I'm interpreting that question in regards to softwares that are used for each asset. So Clint, please correct me if you want to ask something else, but the vast majority of our asset classes are in an Excel-based system, multi-tiered, different complexities of Excel, maybe supplemented with something else. Mature assets both have management systems available to them, but most everybody is in an Excel-based process, supplemented by GIS. So the enterprise systems that we do have available to us are AGOL based and linking in the field, EasyMax Mobile, other systems to collect data in the field and geo-reference it to a location that then is informed in a GIS. And of course, Excel-based data, if tied to an attribute or tied to an asset, can also be looked at in that geospatial environment. So we have multiple systems at our disposal, and it really just depends on the maturity of each individual asset class. I'm going to pause there because I'm not entirely sure I interpreted Clint's question correctly. So.
Clint, feel free to type in if you have other things, but let's move on to the next one. For roads, there are several treatments which prolong the life of the road asset. Do you have the effect of live treatments? The various treatments have on a condition, for example, IRI. So Justin or Meredith?
I can say that I can make another shameless plug. Yes, the answer is our pavement program is a mature program that runs optimization scenarios to understand the various different treatments available to them, and in fact tie it back to performance outcomes. So they are always looking at being nimble in the treatments they choose before adjusting any performance targets. And if you'd like to hear more about that, my expert for pavement out of our materials technology office is presenting in a session in this conference on Wednesday. So shameless plug for my colleague.
Justin, I know you're not a pavements person, but do you want to add anything?
Yeah, actually, I think both states use a very similar pavement system. We have a treatment matrix, so we do have the effect of the outcomes. So
great.
Yeah.
Thanks. So the next question was actually one for Justin. The latex process chart. Did you consider the benefit or cost at different condition scores? If you repair later, you will spend longer time at low service level, maybe.
Yeah, excellent question, actually. We look at increase in life as an increase to the overall score that pavement had. So if you latex early, you'll get longer effective life because you've increased its score. If you latex later, you're going to get the same relative increase in numerical increase, but it will only increase your overall condition score so much. So let's say you do a latex in condition state 7, right? We have a thing that says, all right, it won't go above a 7. We call it a ceiling, but we've added duration to that 7 to say that, all right, it will stay in condition state 7, 6, and 5 longer because of the latex. Whereas if you do a latex in, let's say, condition state 4, it's only going to give you a 1.5 increase in your overall rating.
Okay.
We're effectively manipulating deterioration as well as our condition.
Other questions?
Sue, there's a question in the chat.
Okay, thanks. So Justin, what's the software you use for motor, or is it an in-house software?
It's an in-house developed software that is available to everyone. It's actually, we've partnered with a firm that produces infrastructure asset management. And the road care and what you call bridge care. So road care and bridge care are both free open source platforms that you can use and benefit from all of our efforts. I don't know if I have a link readily available, but it is available on the web for download, at least the desktop versions. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe the consultant has made a web page that is not up, but will be up shortly, that you could go in and actually run your own scenarios based on the logic that we have created.
Great. Other questions? So what you've seen here is 2 examples of fairly well-developed processes that have built on existing legacy systems that have come together. But one of the things we can say is you could actually it wouldn't work very well. Still use a box of index cards with everything on, and you could sort them in different ways. And you can think about this as starting off very simply and then building up to these optimization tools and decision-making tools. But it's setting the scenarios to get your context right. So Meredith had talked about how she can't get people, she has a challenge in getting her people to think about what if you have an unconstrained funding environment, because what she's trying to do is foster an environment to innovate and look at things in different ways, to understand what you're trading off and what's involved. And so that's one strategy to do that. There's many different ways to go about this. Am I correct in making that assumption, Meredith, that you're trying to get people thinking about it?
Yeah, so a good example of that is our intelligent transportation systems asset class. They have control boxes and other things that have been retired. They're not in service, but they're still in the field because it's low risk to leave them there, but it costs something to take them out. But asset management best practice would be, it is still an asset in the field and we should be dealing with it. But in a fiscally unconstrained environment, I can get them to program the cost to actually remove it. But in a fiscally constrained environment, they're never going to remove it because it's just money that we don't have to spend.
Right.
So it's
That's a great example.
Even that little example of just all those decisions have to be made.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so please think about some questions, but what I wanted to do is just summarize some tools and resources. So let me just go back to my presentation. But as I said, please continue to, I've lost my, let me just make sure I've got my presentation somewhere. There it is. Continue to add some questions, because we will have a little bit more time to answer questions. Okay. So just going back for a minute about why asset management. You know, we hear a lot about the American Society of Civil Engineers report card. As I say to my students, if you came home with this report card, it'd be pretty abysmal. And there's lots of comments that, you know, this is self-serving, but it's trying to raise awareness. But asset management becomes important because we've got all these overarching things: congestion, aging infrastructure, preserving investments, economic growth. And over the last year, the financial situation has been an added reason. We thought things were bad, but it's got worse in doing this. So it's a platform for wealth, economic wealth and social development. It relates to quality of life, sustainability, the national economy, and it's a really large investment. So the benefits that you see here come into these groups of sustainability, performance and cost effectiveness, communication, accountability and credibility. And what you're doing is you're actually providing the data, the tools, and the information that supports these pieces. So MAP 21 made this requirement of asset management, and so this was a multi-year process to get to the point that this became important, that all states had to have risk-based asset management plans on the national highway system. They all came in 2019. They're widely available. You can look at them, and there's a set of regulations that go with that specify what's needed and the contents of those plans. And so in the original legislation, it talked about that you needed a summary listing of the pavement and bridge assets, that you needed objectives and measures, that you need some kind of performance gap identification, the life cycle cost and risk management analysis. So that's part of why both Meredith and Justin talked about life cycle cost and risk analysis, the financial plan, and the investment strategies. And so there's a language here that talks about the requirements and what can be included, but the absolute minimum was to include the pavement and bridges. So there's links here to the final rule. These slides will make available. There's also the link to the FHWA guidance, and Meredith had also mentioned tamguide.com, which is a great resource, and I also included the link to the FTA transit guidance, because transit has to also develop transportation asset management plans. So the basic asset management plan structure. Yeah.
Sue, I don't know if other people can see your slides, but I can't.
You can't. Okay.
I think you're showing the slide right now, but I can't see it. I don't know if others can.
All right.
I was seeing it.
You were seeing it.
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay.
well, then never mind. Ignore me.
Okay. So is it just Meredith, or is it others as well? Maybe just.
I think it's
Let me
just
try again.
It looks like others can see. I think it's just Meredith.
Okay. All right. We'll just set this going again. I'm sure by the people doing the last few presentations, they'll become experts on this. All right. So Meredith, you seeing that now?
No, but don't worry about it. If I'm the
Okay.
only one.
I think you're okay. And you may need to stop your own screen sharing.
I'm good on my
No?
end.
Okay. All right.
Sorry.
All right. We'll leave it. Oh, no
Just
problem.
going.
So anyway, what's listed on this slide is what the requirements are for the asset management plan structure. And when you go and look at all the states' asset management plan structures, you're going to see these elements in there. They all have them. They're developed to different levels. So I actually did a paper last year on the risk analysis and management analysis parts of it, and there's an incredible diversity in the level of sophistication of what people did in that risk management analysis. But as you will see, these will evolve over time. These are not intended to be static documents. They're intended to be something that evolves and changes, and organizations will develop their risk analysis. But you see the requirement for the life cycle planning and the investment strategies as they go together. So these are all parts of the asset management plan that's required for the states. But remember, it's very limited because it's national highway system and it's pavements and bridges, but it's experience with that will help to build other areas as well. So we've talked about maturity. And the idea is that you start off with something simple and you build to an advanced version of it. So this table is a summary of the attributes of the basic versus an advanced system. So a low level of maturity versus high level of maturity, where you would, in a basic system, use existing measures of level of service, but in an advanced system, you might have consultation with your stakeholders to determine what they are. Just to take another example, the improvement plan might be simply a plan of action. It could be simple prioritization, as opposed to an advanced version takes evidence of action. And so the last attribute here was whether you have optimized decision making. In a basic system, you will have basic maintenance planning. In an advanced system, you would predict the life cycle costs and use those forecast deterioration and your information on costs and your multi-attribute decision making to take into account of that. So this is just an example of how they go together. So I stole this slide from Chris Champion, who's the equivalent of the American Public Works Association for Australia, and he makes the point that you need these enablers to make it happen: a team, a plan, information systems and tools, service delivery models, quality management, and continuous improvement. So we've talked about all those things. So Meredith talked very clearly about assembling the team and how it's evolving and will eventually move to an asset management office. Justin talked about the role the bridge sections has and how that also applies with the pavement. Embedded in this is a process and plan and these kinds of data and tools to support it and how you deliver it. And so we haven't talked a lot about the quality management side of it. I think everyone's learning about that in more detail, but embedded in the process is the continuous improvement. So one of the points I like to make is everyone's implementation experience is different. And if you look at the TAIM library of the different plans in each of the different states, you'll see an amazing diversity of what's going on. If you're thinking about, well, what's a good strategy? Looking at those plans gives you some ideas. And what you'll see in the plans is a wide variety of not only the assets, but how they were developed, who was involved in the teams, what kind of stakeholder consultation, whether there were workshops used or it was just a group that worked on the strategy. But embedded in all this is a shift in culture in organizations. And I think both Meredith and Justin have given some small examples of that in how it's been changed. And the idea is that you can implement this in different ways. So, Justin talks about asset management from the perspective of his experience in the bridge environment, but it's just one unit of that, and it's different sets of experiences of whether you have an asset management office or you integrate a team in different ways. But one of the things that has been very clear as we've gone on these asset management journeys is that you do need to have buy-in from the top management and from staff across the agency, and those data and tools are pretty critical to making this work. So I'm interested in hearing about which of the enablers your organization has in place or working on or your support. And so we'll go back to a poll on that in a minute before I actually go into some of the details. So let me just go back to the poll.
Hey, Sue, before you do that,
Yep.
We have a question in our question and answer from John.
Okay.
Maybe you want to answer that now.
So yeah, this is a good time to do that. In both Maryland and PA, what is your current biggest pain point with your existing process or systems, and how do you look to address them in the future? Okay, go for it, guys. Meredith, do you want to go first?
No, Justin.
You can give it to Justin.
All right, pain points. There are many, but I would say that there are two that stick out in my mind far more than anything else. One of the problems is that we have both bridge and pavement asset management systems, and those systems produce recommended treatments, but those treatments aren't necessarily so it still takes a person to put those treatments together to make a project. I think that that's going to be one of the bigger challenges we have in the coming years is to marry those two together and produce a series of recommended projects. That's problem number one. Problem number two is I think that with introduction of asset management to any organization, you're going to have some level of cultural change. And that is incredibly difficult, particularly when some of these principles are different, or in some cases opposite to what people are used to. Organizational change and acceptance, and getting people to understand, you know, the benefits, and working toward that. I find that to be a big challenge in our organization.
Great. Meredith.
The pain point that brought me to laughter tears recently is the chasm between internal centralized asset management and the management of the asset in the field, in the maintenance and the operations side of things. All of that is treating an asset and part of that asset's life cycle, but it is a decentralized management of those assets. And without some level of centralized respect for the full life cycle, or not respect, ownership of the full life cycle of an asset class, it's extremely difficult to do that in a multi-tiered environment and objective decision environment when you are just not connected with the full life cycle of the asset. Now, this isn't the case for all of the asset classes, but it is certainly the case for some of the asset classes. And that's the pain point that we are hoping to challenge with the centralized performance-based asset management out of the asset management office. So, you know, change what Justin was talking about in terms of changing philosophy, changing and nudging people into a new practice. That's already fully underway. We thank our stars every day that we no longer have to convince leadership of this path forward. They are 100% champions and in the corner for change. It's just nudging the existing practice into and practitioners into a different way of thinking about owning the full life cycle of an asset, as opposed to owning your piece of the life cycle.
Great question, great answers. Yeah, it'd be fun to see some others. So I'm just going to launch this poll because interested to see where people see, and we'll see if anyone's still awake. We haven't put you to sleep. So this is the idea of which enablers does your organization have in place or working on and supporting, just to get a sense of what's going on. Not seeing any responses. Now we are. Good. At least there's a few people awake. So a lot of people have an asset management team, the information and tools, recognition of the continuous improvement. So this is, you could select multiple answers here. But the most prevalent of the asset management team and the information and systems and tools. Less prevalent are the asset management service and delivery model. So in some ways that was what Justin talked about as his challenge, the treatments to the projects, and then the quality management. I think that's a struggle for everyone. So thanks for the input on that. So I just wanted to go back and talk a little bit about some resources. So the TRB Committee on Asset Management, Transportation Asset Management, is pretty active. They have a certain goals to support this area, and lots of activities related to collaboration with USDOT. They have the Transportation Asset Management Research Roadmap. They develop research statements. They organize the national conference that Meredith mentioned, and a good way to get involved and have a network of people that you can interact with. So the website's here that you can move for that. There's also the AASHTO Committee on Performance-Based Measures, which has a Transportation Asset Management Subcommittee. The two committees actually have joint meetings on a fairly regular basis and interact in many ways for doing that. So again, another great resource that you can be involved in. The AASHTO TAIM portal has a ton of resources. If you're going looking for information, they have documents, events, and tools. So that's another set of resources you can go looking for. The series of conferences that began in 1996 with one in Washington, D.C. that was really trying to look at sort of private sector asset management experience and how it applied to public sector transportation area agencies was the beginning of trying to formalize this in lots of different ways. So the 2021 conference is Boston, so I will add to Meredith's plug here that abstracts are due at the end of the month. It's a great environment, but there's also a lot of presentation materials from the TAM mega meeting that occurred remotely over the summer that you can get on the TAM portal. So these are all different ways of looking at what's happening. Historically, when you look through, you'll see the evolution of this body of work. FHWA's Office of Stewardship, Oversight and Management has responsibilities for leadership in asset management. They do things like partner with AASHTO and TRB, conduct peer exchanges and other activities like that. And so there's a whole bunch of activities that's going on in terms of their guidance, the webinars, the links. They have the links to the transportation asset management plans. They have some videos, publications, and then there's a whole body of literature on risk-based transportation asset management that serves as a great resource that you can look at. There's also a boatload of relevant national cooperative highway research projects. And so I've listed these. I'm not going to go through these, but it gives you a set of resources as well as a synthesis project. And then there's a series of peer exchanges that occurred over the years. These are continuing to evolve. Sometimes it's a little hard to find the reports. There's actually one going on that I'm actually starting to facilitate tomorrow between Louisiana, Kentucky, and another state, looking at their plans. And earlier this year, there'd been Maryland, Pennsylvania, Maine, had got together in Harrisburg pre-COVID. Actually, it was one of the last events that had occurred. So you've got these different activities that again let you see what practices are, and the reports are quite insightful. From 2010, there was a TR News, and that's basically what we wanted to cover here. So I would like to open it up for questions again. Before we wrap up here. Got a few minutes. Justin, any closing remarks?
Well, I think the stuff we covered today was pretty good. I think it leads a lot to maybe we should start to organize a 201 structure, because I think a lot of the stuff we talked about leads nicely to the 201. I'm not sure what those guys are talking about next. So
Simon and Bob are going to talk about, going to offer the Asset Management 201 in the next section. I know you'll get a lot of details. They both have a lot of experience of working with state DOTs and other organizations, ranging from some of the nitty-gritty about how you implement these things and manage the process, to setting those high-level goals. So I think the Asset Management 201 workshop will actually be really insightful and helpful. Meredith, anything to add?
Yeah, as I mentioned, I still haven't found the program for this conference, but I promise Jeff Hall with Maryland State Highway Administration is going to talk about pavement programs on Wednesday. And so I encourage you to go there, and then all of those great resources and websites, Sue, that you mentioned,
Right.
just is a wonderful community of practice out there for additional information.
There was one last question. Justin, can you share your treatment matrix?
No, I'll look into that. I'm not sure if we can or we can't, but if we can, I will gladly put that out there.
As part of the Penn State UTC consortium, we have been assembling treatment matrices for a whole bunch of projects, and it will be in some reports that come out, hopefully in the next 6 months or so. Corinna or Steve, was the session recorded?
Yes.
Yes, and that will be available for participants, right?
Yes.
So that's how you find your information about the links, and hopefully everyone found some value in this. Thank you for participating. Really appreciate it. Thank you to Meredith and Justin. I always love hearing about your experiences with the practice, and I hope everyone has a great session. Conference and continues to be involved. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.